All right. Welcome back, everyone, to our latest meeting of the online Peace Science Colloquium. So if you're tuning in live or watching the video on YouTube, and this is your first time, welcome. This is the online seminar series of the Peace Science Society, and our goal is to bring the great research that happens at the annual meeting out to you all in your homes or offices or wherever you are all year round. So this week we have a really nice paper from Yu Mei, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Rochester. She's going to be presenting a paper called Misaligned Interests and the Credibility of Alleged Support. We have a excellent discussant who's an expert in third-party intervention, peacekeeping, all the sort of relevant topics. Lindsay Reid, she's an assistant professor at Gettysburg College, so thanks in advance for the careful read of the paper, Lindsay. And I'll also be offering some discussant comments because you and I have talked about this paper before, and it's kind of close to my area of research too. I guess I should have introduced myself. I'm Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. So with that, we'll have a presentation of the paper by you. So you, the floor is yours.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much for organizing this workshop, and many thanks to Brad Smith and Lindsay Reid for agreeing to being my discussant. So I am Mei from the University of Rochester, and I'm super happy to present my ongoing project, Misaligned Interests and the Credibility of Alleged Support. The involvement of external actors has been an important element in both international and civil conflict. Powerful external actors with superior military and economic resources are able to manipulate the balance of power between adversaries and the opportunity costs of war, thereby influencing how the adversaries bargain, whether a negotiated settlement can be reached, and if so, what the settlement looks like. As self-interested actors, third parties are concerned not only with whether a conflict will end in peace, but also with whether they can benefit from the peace that is achieved. Their incentives to shape bargaining outcomes to their advantage make their interests and intervention strategies closely related to whether wars occur and how wars end. The contemporary security environment is characterized by a shift away from formal alliance structures towards temporary, issue-specific marriages of convenience. This suggests that despite our cooperation in fighting a common enemy, the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend because of conflicting interests on other issues. In other words, external actors, even if they generally favor one side of a conflict, do not always have perfectly aligned interests with the side they favor. Just as uncertainty about the strength and resolve of a rival power is common, so is uncertainty about a military partner. Because military coalitions are not equally coherent, there is always uncertainty about the extent to which one's partner will come to one's aid in a crisis. Although misaligned interests between military partners are common, existing conflict studies have not paid sufficient attention to their implications. This article fills this gap by examining how misaligned interests between partners affect the way an external actor signals its willingness to intervene on behalf of its friend. Communication and signaling are important because disputants usually resort to diplomatic approaches to resolve a conflict before actually going to war. Even if a war is already underway, the conflicting parties are still negotiating whether and how to end it. Potential interveners can use a variety of approaches ranging from cheap-talk diplomacy to costly signaling to express and sometimes misrepresent their willingness to intervene in a conflict in order to manipulate the conflict dynamics in their favor. There are many factors that external actors have to consider when deciding what signals to send. For example, what costs they have to bear in order to send a signal, how effective their signals are in achieving their goals, and how their signals affect the probability of war. So among the various factors, This article focuses on how the conflict of interest with its partner enters into an external actor's deliberations about what signals to send. That is, the external actor must consider the possibility of agency slack in which its partner does not use its support in the way it wants. To study how misaligned interests between military partners affect the credibility of an external actor's signal, I developed a model in which two disputants engage in an automated bargaining game to resolve a conflict, and an external actor supports one of the disputants. The external actor shares a common goal with the side it supports, but they also have some misaligned interests, and the extent of the misalignment is the external actor's private information. The external actor can communicate this information through cheap talk diplomacy. So it is noteworthy that I have the external actor use cheap talk diplomacy rather than costly signals to communicate because, as I said, there are many factors that the external actor has to consider when deciding which signal to send. And having the external actor use only cheap talk diplomacy to communicate allows us to focus only on how the misalignment of interests enters the external actor's policy deliberations without having to consider the cost the external actor has to suffer from sending that signal. And the major takeaways of the paper are summarized as follows. So first, the existence of misaligned interests increases the credibility of the external actor's signal, whether it is a signal of strong or weak willingness to intervene. So if the external actor has perfectly aligned interests with its partner, it will have an incentive to exaggerate its affinity with its partner in order to help its partner gain as much as possible from a settlement. As a result, this signal has no effect on the disputant's bargaining behavior because everybody knows that the external actor has an incentive to exaggerate. Well, when misaligned interests are present, the external actor's signal becomes more credible because an external actor with low affinity to its partner has no incentive to pretend to have close affinity. This is because if the alleged support causes the supported side to gain more on issues that reflect both their common and conflicting interests, then a close ally will have different preferences than a weak ally about what settlements are better. So in particular, a close ally will place a high value on their common interests and thus truthfully review its strong willingness to support its partner despite their conflicting interests. However, a weak ally will be concerned that its partner will become overly aggressive over their misaligned interests and thus truthfully review its weak willingness to support despite their shared goals. So the intuition is that the alleged support of the external actor will be seen as credible only if the external actor is still willing to signal support to the protege, even if knowing that the protege will use the increased leverage over their misaligned interests. And second, the existence of misaligned interests is only a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the credibility of the external actor's signal. So this is because in a multi-issue bargaining environment, disputants can trade the issues they value less in exchange for the issue they value more. As a result, if the alleged support helps increase the relative power of the supported side, then instead of using the increased leverage equally across all disputed issues, the supported side will use the increased leverage on the issue it values most. This suggests that the protege might use the increased leverage only on one of the multiple disputed issues, creating an incentive for the external actor to either exaggerate or downplay its willingness to provide support. So if the protege uses the external actor's support only on their common interests, then the external actor will exaggerate its willingness to intervene in order to advance their common goals. While if the protege uses the support only over the issue on which they disagree, then the external actor, regardless how close it is to the protege, will downplay its willingness to support in order to discourage its partner from being overly aggressive over their misaligned interests. So this paper makes several contributions to the existing studies of alliance politics and cheap talk diplomacy. So regarding alliance politics, this article advances of our understanding of how misaligned interests between military partners affect conflict dynamics through their influence on how a potential ally signals its willingness to intervene before actually taking any action. The existing literature on alliance politics links the affinity between strategic partners with their willingness to form a military coalition and whether alliance treaties can be actually implemented once an alliance is formed. Well, my research shows that between the alliance formation stage and the actual implementation stage, there is a stage in which a potential ally attempts to manipulate its partner's beliefs and behavior by signaling how willing it is to intervene. The signaling stage is important because incentives to misrepresent make it possible for an ally's signal to be inconsistent with what it will actually do if bargaining breaks down. And by exploiting its private information, the ally may be able to achieve its goals through bargaining and force a settlement it favors without getting into a war it does not want. And regarding cheap talk diplomacy, this paper recognized the importance of issue linkage and argues that the disputants' incentive to trade concessions across issues affect a potential intervener's deliberations about what signals to send. It should not be ignored that wars are known for its winner-take-all nature in the sense that wars do not end until solutions to all disputed issues are packaged into one peace agreement. That is, as long as one issue remains unsolved, agreements on all other issues cannot be enforced and are subject to revision. The existing literature on issue linkage suggests that bundling two issues into a single offer facilitates credible communication. And the underlying mechanism is that when only one issue is on the table, one always has an incentive to overstate the importance of that issue, while adding another issue dimension turns the actor's statement about the importance of an issue into a comparative one, which means that if the actor claims that one issue is important, he simultaneously reveals that the other issue is unimportant. So by extending a bilateral bargaining setting to a trilateral one, I present a scenario in which credible communication cannot be achieved under issue linkage. And existing research tends to focus on uncertainty about rival powers and argues that the existence of conflicting interests is an obstacle to resolving uncertainty through communication. Well, this article shifts the attention to uncertainty between military partners, which is as common as uncertainty between adversaries, and argues that the existence of misaligned interests can increase the credibility of an external actor's alleged support for its partner by discouraging the external actor from exaggerating their closeness. So this is a brief introduction of what the paper is about and what the major takeaways are and what the contributions that the paper makes. So due to time limit, I will only let you know what the structure of the paper without going into detail of the model. So in the paper, I first present a baseline in which an external actor has perfectly aligned interests with its military partner and shows that under perfect preference alignment, the external actor's signal is not informative and influential on the bargaining behavior of the external actor. And then I introduce a main model, which is like everything in the baseline remains the same in the main model, except that the external actor has misaligned interests with its partner. And if this is the case, then under certain conditions, there exists an informative equilibrium in which different types of the external actors send different signals, and their signals are can have some influence on the disputant's bargaining behavior. And by comparing the baseline with the main model, I show that the presence of misaligned interests is necessary, but is not a sufficient condition for the external actor's signal to be credible. And finally, I use the case of Namibian War of Independence to illustrate the mechanism by which the existence of misaligned interests prevents an external actor with a low affinity with his partner from exaggerating their closeness. So this is an example of, it's a very classic example of misaligned interests between military partners and the simultaneous resolution of multiple disputed issues. So this is all I have for today, and I look forward to Brad and Lindsay's discussions and comments on the paper. And thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you, Yu. Let's see if we can stop the screen sharing.
Okay.
Am I? Okay. Awesome. Thanks for the presentation. So you, before we get started with the discussant comments, could you talk for just a second about sort of where you are with the paper, what kind of feedback would be most useful just to kind of frame our discussion?
Oh, So I have just finished this draft, and I hope to like send it out to a journal by the end of like this year. So writing is something that I care a lot about. So especially about how I should like whether it's clear the mathematical stuffs are clear enough, and is there anything wrong with the proposition, and whether because like since as I specify the informative equilibrium, this is very long and that seems to be very complicated to non-formal people. So I'm wondering what is the best way to like make the formal part most readable to non-formal people. And also I'm wondering whether the case is adequate enough here. And also yeah, so if you find anything wrong with the model, I would be very happy to like listen to that, and like if there is any suggestions on the model part. And in addition to that, just some writing style and whether it's like readable enough, and whether, because I am not a native speaker, so if you find anything like hard to understand, please let me know.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. So Lindsay, I'll turn it over to you. We'll just take a, 10 minutes or so. Let's download all the discussing comments, then I'll offer mine, and then we'll have a conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. So I just want to say thanks so much for the invitation to be a discussant. I was actually May's mentor when she was in 2 of my undergrad classes when I taught at UC Davis. And now being at a place where I primarily work with undergrads, it's really cool to me. I get a lot of joy from seeing them go on to do amazing things. And in this case, become a young scholar who's totally going to contribute important insights to the field. So this is a proud mentor moment for me. So I'm going to preface my comments with the caveat that I'm not a game theorist. I'm not going to pretend to be one today. I think though, like given May, what you said about, hoping to send this out, and the reality that not all reviewers on papers are going to be formal modelers. I hope that my comments will be helpful because I think they're probably in line with the type of comments you may get from a general IR audience. And, for better or worse, you do need to appeal to that audience to get the article published, get it cited. So that's where my comments are coming from, and probably Brad will be better suited to get into the nitty-gritty of the model and perhaps revisions of packaging that. I'm going to begin with framing. So I think in terms of, well, you mentioned something about writing. Your writing is excellent. It's very clear. So I want to start with that. I think in terms of the framing, the introduction of the paper, I think it needs to be more concise. This is a comment I get from reviewers all the time, that my introductions are too long. So your introduction needs to be more concise, and I think it needs to be more direct in terms of what puzzle you're seeking to address. So the introduction of the paper, it talks about brokering settlements, and it talks about alliances, and a bit about broader intervention and support and signaling from interveners. And I think just starting out the paper, it sort of left me wondering, like, what lane are we in terms of the literatures that we're contributing to? So I think it would be really helpful to just be really direct about what the research question is, like the scope of the research question. Are we talking about the trustworthiness of specifically signals from allies alone, or from possible military interveners, which could be allies, formal or informal, or a broader pool, or from other third parties too, who are considering maybe softer forms of intervention. And I think here, framing is all the more important. It's not that I'm holding your paper or formal papers to a higher bar, but I do think it's especially important because we live in a world in which most IR scholars are not formal modelers. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what side of the debate you stand on, most IR publications also aren't formal. And again, I don't applaud that move, but it's the reality. So in the introduction, I think you especially want to be really deliberate about saying what literature you're contributing to, which puzzle you're addressing, and what is your paper doing in simple terms that other papers haven't done. And I think some of that came through better in the presentation than in the current introduction of the paper. You could talk about to what real world scenarios is your model most relevant. And I think most importantly, like the intro of the paper is your opportunity to like really prime the reader as to like the direction you're going to be taking them. It's not that there's a single correct lane for the framing of the paper, but you can choose that and choose it strategically in a way that kind of gets the reader to where they need to be. So I think that's a overall framing issue that luckily that's not a huge challenge to work on, but something that can really make a difference in terms of submitting this for review and seeing positive outcomes. As I mentioned, I'm going to reserve specific comments on the model to others, but I do have like some bigger picture points that maybe non-game theorists reviewers might ask. One thing that I wrote down as I was getting into the model is, you know, a question of, is it possible that you're underselling the importance and like contribution of your work and of the model itself? Are there many other models that are dealing with the kind of like combination of multiple issues and conflicting interests and multiple parties in the way that yours does? So I'm going to defer to others on this, but if others also think you might be underselling the novelty of your model and its contributions, you really should highlight that. The next question I had, and maybe this is standard, but I was wondering, just kind of based on how the paper was set up, why are the outcomes of the game war versus settlement? So the intro is framing the paper as a story about decisions to intervene and how to signal trustworthiness. And obviously, I know those things matter for decisions of war and peace, but they also matter in other ways. And so I guess I was a little thrown off by the model walking players down that strategic path. And maybe I'm not making a judgment call on whether that was right or wrong, but it comes back to the whole, like, which specific research question and which specific literature are you contributing to? And that can shape kind of the discussion in the model as well. And then I think the only other thing just kind of generally on the model that I wanted to say is with respect to the world of perfectly aligned interests. I think it would be helpful to have some examples or examples that come close to that scenario, right? So I'm left wondering, do these cases exist? Or does the scenario simply exist as part of the modeling process? And that's okay too. But if there are case examples that fit within the realm of perfectly or almost perfectly aligned interests, I think it would be cool to leverage those and leverage that information in the case analysis part of the work in order to drive home how that variation in behavior and outcomes may be derived in part from that part of your story. Okay. In terms of, and I should have said, I will send you these in writing. So I know it's a lot, but in terms of the scope and applicability of the model and its implications. So a few times throughout the paper, I thought about how intervention and support, it's really sticky. Like there's this significant path dependence of support for other actors. And so I know you're interested in how actors can send credible signals and thus be trustworthy in their support. But I think in many cases, or one thing that I think about is that some interests are so salient to third parties, and some intervention and support of various forms is so sticky given past ties or geopolitical interests that regardless of whether or not interests align, recipients know that they're going to continue to receive support, right? Because it's always been there. They know that it's like essential for this third party. And so, you know, I think part of me was thinking about this from the perspective of the United States during the Cold War. Support from the US during the Cold War was in many situations credible, not because of any sort of misaligned interests, though those existed, but because of the geopolitical interests that were so salient that they were overriding any differences that the US had with groups. And so I don't know if this is something, I'm trying to think of a suggestion that will be helpful here. It could be something that you talk about as you set up your case, because that is a Cold War case. You know, it could be something that maybe is already accounted for in the model and I missed it, but that is a question that I had. And then more broadly on the scope question, I think, you know, being clear about in which situations are we expecting your model to apply? Is it applying to cases where that external support is so sticky that it's going to happen regardless of interest alignment? Or is it only applying in cases where potential recipients are sort of like shopping around for someone to support them? And or is it some other scenario? And so I think, again, from the perspective of like, I could be the non-game theorist reviewer of a paper like this, those are the type of questions that I would want answered. And then my very last set of comments is about empirical implications. And I'm sorry if that is a comment that for like game theorists is like the bane of your existence. But I feel like I have to ask about it. So I wish, or I sort of wish, that we still lived in a world in which formal models could be published on their own. But I've seen enough colleagues who do formal modeling to know that it's rare, it's hard, it makes the whole thing more challenging. So I think it's fair to say then, for better or worse, that you do need to do more to address the empirical implications of your model in the paper as it's written right now. So I don't necessarily, I'm not meaning like, okay, you need to do the superhero thing of like having the formal model and the empirical analysis all in one paper, plus a case and all of that. Like, that's too much. You can't do that. But I do think you need to address the kind of like, whether it be testable hypotheses or empirical implications that are coming out of the model. How might you or other scholars use this model to shape future empirical research? And really, I'm bringing this up because, again, I've seen friends and colleagues get hammered on this specific issue time and time again in review processes. And maybe you are anticipating that, but I would prefer to preempt it. And maybe there's something that you can think about adding to the paper such that you increase your chances of making reviewers happy on that particular issue. So I'm happy to, in discussion, maybe brainstorm certain things, but that's it for me. So I'll pass it over now to Brad.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. So first I want to like strongly endorse basically everything Lindsay said, but in particular, the first comment, because my sort of main comment is very similar. I think, I mean, this was a like hard learned lesson for me, but it is, Lindsay's exactly right that, it is important. And I think it's important both for publication, like the reality of publishing formal work, but also it's important for your work to have an impact, right? That people who aren't working with these models every day can get something out of it, right? Because I mean, that's what I view as the point of doing formal theory. It's I can tell you something verbally, and then I can back it up and show you that it's logically valid, right? So like I think the model, the analysis is tight, but I think on the front end of the paper, I think in some ways the intuition is really coming across clearly, and in some ways I think it could maybe be beefed up. And I think so there's kind of two things. So I kind of have two comments about like the framing and presentation that leads into the model. So the first is exactly what Lindsay said, which is I think the paper could benefit from a stronger hook, because right now, and I think this is a thing that I myself and many formal theorists early in their career fall into, is it's natural to sort of frame the paper around the differences in the model, right? And because that's what gives you the results. But I think and that indeed may be the way that you came into this research. In many cases it is, right? You're looking at a body of theory and then you think, okay, well, if we change these things to match some empirical thing, we get different results, right? And that's consequential and that's important. That should be something that's out there, right? But I think in terms of explaining to a general audience why that's something you should care about, it makes more sense to, if you can, frame the analysis around, you can either a puzzle, like something that we see in the world that's confusing, right? So one way to go about it might be to, you have this case, and one way to go about it might be to say, well, in this case, we observe this outcome, and under the previous theorizing, you would have expected outcome X, but indeed we see outcome Y. And that is confusing, and I'm going to offer a model that explains what's going on, right? So that might be, we can talk in discussion. There are a variety of ways to do that, but that's sort of one common approach. And I think that paper would benefit a lot from sort of the first couple of paragraphs being that. The other benefit of that is that if you lead off with, grounding the general strategic interaction that you're interested in modeling in a specific case, it makes it easy for every reader. I don't care whether they're a formal theorist, in their own work or not. It makes it easier for every reader to sort of conceptualize what you're doing, right? Because then when I see the model, I can say, oh, well, actor 1 is the United States. Actor 2 is the Soviet Union, or whatever, the sort of relevant application for the motivation is. So yeah, I completely agree. I think, and that's probably something we should try to focus on in the discussion, is brainstorming stuff like that. I agree with Lindsay that I think in my experience, and I think if you look at what's published, the papers that are where their primary contribution is a new formal theoretic explanation of something, I do think you need to sort of beef up the empirical side of the paper. And like Lindsay said, it's not really feasible to have like a quantitative test in the paper because you're already at 10,000 words or something, and I think so. In my experience, I think a lot of this can be, so this leads into, so Lindsay's suggestion here sort of leads into a specific suggestion that I had about the case. So I think it would be constructive to, at the beginning of the case study, just explain very clearly to the reader what the role of the case study in the paper is. Because case studies can kind of do a few different things. The way yours is written, I view it as doing, I view the role of the case study as basically a plausibility illustration, right? Where you're trying to convince us that the strategic logic in the model is happening in this situation, and that one could not adequately understand the decision-making of the relevant actors without having understood the strategic incentives that are embodied in your model. And so I would suggest just having a paragraph at the beginning of the case study that tells the reader that that's what you're going to do. And then with that, I think, when I read through the case study, you do the thing which is really nice of being very clear about state 1 is this actor, state 2 is this actor. I would move that to the front. Just lead off on the front end. And that way the reader can be thinking, okay, this case study is going, like the goal of this case study is not to test the model, right? But rather it's to illustrate that the model's logic is plausible in a relevant case, right? And then once I know that that's what we're doing, you say, this is how you can map it on, and this is why it's an appropriate case. You do that. I just think it'd be constructive to move it up, because there's a lot of background information about the case before, like, I, as the reader, don't quite know how I'm supposed to interpret that background without knowing which actor is which, right? So okay, let's see. So I have a couple of things about the case. So there's two. I'll come back to the model, and I'll try not to get too far off in the weeds. But for the case, I have two comments that I think these are likely to come up in review. So the first one is that your model is one in which, like, what you're interested in is cheap talk, and there's a discussion of the U.S. in your case used a variety of different signals, and one of them was sanctions. And typically the way sanctions are understood in the literature is that they're costly signals. And so I think explaining to the reader sort of, you may want, because there's a variety of signals used, I'm not sure quite what the best way to handle that is, because it does seem like the sanctions were an important part of the US's strategy here. So you can't really ignore them. But at the same time, I don't know that it's quite accurate to describe them as the same kind of signal that's being modeled. So some thought into how to, explain that to the reader and how to, I don't know if that's, I mean, one option to consider would be to sort of think about, well, so, you could go back to the model and, think about, well, what if there was an opportunity? I'm not sure you want to get into that because that kind of fundamentally changes what you're doing. The second, and this is sort of more a question about and this leads back. So I'm going back to the model because this leads into one of my main comments about the model. A question and like a scope condition that comes up, and I'm not sure, I don't think that this scope condition clearly does or does not, interact with this case in a particular way. I'm not super familiar with the case. But in the model, the two issues are very independent of one another, right? In the sense that a concession on X does not imply that we must also make a concession on Y, right? And it's not clear to me that in that context, that's true, right? So if you think about like troop withdrawals, that might sort of have implications for settlement of the other issue, right? And so that's sort of a more general comment about the model, that I think that's a scope condition, and I'm not quite sure how to think about it. And it's a simplifying assumption, and I think that's totally fine. And there are certainly cases where that's relevant, right? So I mean, it's sort of in an extreme case, you think about like there's two different territorial areas that are disputed, right? And they're like not connected to each other, right? Well, a concession on one doesn't mean that we have to make a concession on the other, right? But there are other issues where it's not clear that we can think of them as like completely independent. And so that might be worth sort of thinking about that as a scope condition and thinking about whether that applies to the case at hand. So I'm gonna offer a couple more comments on the model, and then I'll stop and we can talk. So I think from a modeling perspective, and this is the reason the reason I'm bringing this up is I think this is relevant for sort of both me and Lindsay's suggestion about being clear about what exactly is the contribution for a general audience. So I think that for people who are sort of really deep in the weeds on this literature, right? So I'm thinking about kind of the relevant set of papers here is, Scott Wolford's 2014 paper, Robert Traeger's papers that you cite, my paper. The main sort of modeling difference here is the introduction of the second issue, right? That's the main thing. And then, but you're interested in, so as far as I can tell, that is the addition to the model that drives the new results, right? Because you get different results from the previous papers, and that's great. But I think what you want to do is, I mean, one thing that formal theory is nice for, one nice property that it has, is that it makes it very clear the connection between how the new things generate the new results. And so I think it's very productive to be able to compare back to previous papers and sort of be able to be very transparent about what is exactly new. And so on this dimension, the notion in which there is preference heterogeneity in this model, I think is a little bit different from how preference heterogeneity has worked in previous models. So here's exactly what I have in mind. So, there's some work from Will Spaniel and Peter Bills have some papers where they think about preference heterogeneity using spatial preferences, right? So it's a single dimension, unlike your paper, right? And then the players have like ideal policy outcomes, right? And it's, it might be here, it might be here, it might be somewhere in the middle. So I think what would be useful is if you could map your model onto that framework and explain. So to be clear, I'm not asking that you change the model, but if I understand your model correctly, you can think of it as follows. And I think the following figure would be really helpful. So you have X and Y, and think about those as the two dimensions, right? And so then any settlement occupies a place in that in that space, right? So then the question is, well, where are 1s, 2s, and 3s ideal points in that space, right? So as far as I understand, 1 and 2, they're perfectly opposed in that, you know, 1's ideal point is at the origin, and then 2's ideal point is at the point 1, 1, right? And then 3's ideal point is on one of the off diagonals, right? And so I think having a figure like that or explaining the model in that way would make it really clear what you mean by preference heterogeneity. Because and the reason I bring this up is that I do think that reviewers are going to kind of want to know what is the difference between the closest models. And as you describe in the paper, I think, you know, my paper and Scott's paper are kind of the two closest. And in mine, I have that ideal point set up. And so I think that'll make a very natural comparison to the way that a lot of people are already thinking about preference heterogeneity in this setting. So that's sort of my first comment on the model. And then the second one, and this goes to Lindsay's suggestion about making everything more readable. So you have sort of two features in the model that I think could be simplified. So that would not change the results and would make it much easier to follow the analysis. So one is that you have a continuum of types. And so I would encourage you to think about, for the presentation of the model in the paper, moving to a 2-type setup. And to be clear, you don't need to get rid of what you've done. You can include that as a robustness check and put all the stuff you've done in an appendix and say, if you're worried about this not working with a continuum of types, you can look at the appendix. I have it there. The reason I think it's worthwhile to move to a 2-type setup is that the nature of the equilibrium that you get is that the continuum of types, they just sort of separate into 2 chunks, right? And that looks a lot like what's going to happen in a 2-type model, where it's like, I just tell you I'm highly aligned or I'm not aligned. And as far as the receiver is concerned, within those 2 categories, there's no, right, they're mixing uniformly within them. And so I don't think you're really going to lose anything in terms of the strategic logic of your results by moving to a 2-type model, but it'll make it much easier for the reader to follow. And it'll also honestly make the logic more transparent, I think, to whoever the reader is. Because like, I'm always a big advocate of sort of trying to take the model and get rid of anything that's not necessary to show the results. And then you can put all the extra stuff in the appendix to assure the reader that if you add the bells and whistles and things, it doesn't make anything fall apart. The second thing is, I wonder if it's also worthwhile to just move to like a binary support decision, right? Support or not, instead of the continuum, because I think it's similar, right? It's like you sort of, there are 2 optimal levels, like, right? Like one if they've signaled that they're aligned and one if they've signaled that they're not. And I don't think you're actually going to lose anything by doing that. I have some other minor stuff, but I don't want to monopolize the time, so I'll stop there. So maybe if you want to sort of get us started with the discussion. We've put a lot out there, and so you should pull on whatever thread you think would be most useful.
Yes, thank you to Lindsay and Brett for those comments, and these are really helpful. So I will respond to several of these comments. So I really appreciate what Lindsay says about the possibility that the external support is always going to be there because the issue at stake is just so salient. So basically, what I said doesn't really contradict the possibility of the possibility that proposed by Lindsay, because what I want to show is just that to compare a scenario where there is misaligned interest with a scenario in which there is no misaligned interest, and show that the existence of misaligned interest can kind of increase the credibility of the signal. So this does not mean that the signal can be credible because of other reasons. So I just need to like highlight that more. And yes, then there are many cases that the external support is just gonna be there. So because the problem is that a signal is credible because the stake is just so high that the external support will always claim to support it despite their conflicting interests. But the counterfactual is what will happen if the issue at stake is not that high. So initially, like, I'm wondering whether so if the external actor only has a low beta, so has low affinity with the partner, whether it will exaggerate its willingness to intervene. So we can only observe the case in which the issue at stake is high, but we cannot observe the counterfactual case in which the issue at stake is low. So that's the point of like having this model and highlight. So the presence of misaligned interests can like prevent exaggeration. Yes, and I also thought about having a motivation case, and I think the most like straightforward one is the one in Ukraine. So everybody is wondering how far the US will go to support Ukraine, and it is obvious that Putin doesn't believe that the US will continue its support for Ukraine. But I thought about having a motivating case at the beginning, but the problem is that, so I am using the case in Namibia, which is like, I don't think most people are familiar with that case. So if I bring that up at the very beginning, then I will have to spend a very long time explaining what's going on in that case. And I think that's kind of like, that may be boring to many people. But if I use the case in Ukraine, which is very straightforward, then the case that I'm using at the beginning will be different from the case study that I do later. So that seems weird as well. So that's why I just didn't include any case at the beginning.
So if I might like interject, so I think that's actually a strength, but right, because it shows that there's multiple cases that it could apply to. So I don't know. I mean, I'll sorry to interrupt, but I don't know that I would view it that way.
Yeah. Oh, okay, and Brad like brought up a question of like sanctions is actually costly signaling instead of cheap talk. So yeah, that's also what I was thinking about. So and I think that's also a strength of like having a binary type space, because if that is the case, I can have a robustness check by saying, okay, I give some cost to the signal sent by the external actor, and I will show that even if the cost is included, the basic logic is still the same. Yeah, that's a good idea. And actually, in the very first version of this paper, I did have a binary type space, but Mark Fay asked me to do the continuous type space because he was afraid that in the binary type space, an informative equilibrium exists because like in a continuous type space, the actor will have an incentive to deviate, but because I only allow binary type space, then I just cut off the possibility that the external actor can deviate. So he wanted me to do a robustness check using the continuous type space. That's how it changed into the current version. Yes. And Brad also mentioned a question that Randy Stone mentioned before, exactly the same question. So he said that in the case of Namibia, the withdrawal of Cuban troops and the withdrawal of South African troops from Namibia was actually like one issue on the two like spectrum. So it's all about like the withdrawal of foreign forces, and they can be addressed. They could not be considered as two independent issues, as you mentioned, and I will have to think more about how to justify that, because I came up with case exactly because it's Chester Crocker, so the Secretary of State in African Affairs. So he explicitly said that the US proposed the linkage policy. So he brought up the word of linkage, and that's why I followed it. So yeah. And I really like the idea of having a figure to compare my setup with the ideal point setup. Yes, and I think like I appreciate that you brought it up, that I kind of undersell the importance of the model by having two issue dimension. And originally the issue linkage part is the part that I want to highlight the most about the paper. But the issue with that is, so when I talked to Mark Fay about this paper, so he brought up a very useful suggestion saying that in order to highlight the importance of issue linkage, I have to include a baseline in which there exists misaligned interest, but issue linkage does not exist, in order to compare with that setup with the model in which both misaligned interest and issue linkage are present. But unfortunately, I didn't come up with a comparable baseline. So this is why I have to like downplay the importance of issue linkage, because it's not that rigorous to say that issue linkage kind of undermine the credibility of the chip toxic. So this was the point that I originally want to highlight, but because I could not think of a comparable baseline, and I have to downplay the importance of issue linkage. So yeah, that's why.
And I think on that issue, I think doing what Brad suggested, both in terms of like the figure, but then just like broader connection to like, here are some of the similar articles, but here's what I'm doing differently, without being like, hey, I'm inventing this entirely amazing new thing. Like not most papers are just like their cumulative progress, and that's how knowledge gets built. And so just even kind of saying how your model is different from even the most similar is a way to sell your model in really effective ways.
Yeah, that's
So-
my response to your comments.
Okay, great. So Lindsay, do you have, I mean, I have a couple of other minor things, but you should go first if you have anything else.
Yeah, I was just gonna circle back to the hook of the introduction. Like, I think that is critical. Like, the case, like that is what I think, again, like I'm not the formal modeler, but I find them so cool and exciting if I'm like, this is helping me understand something, not just something theoretically, a real world occurrence, a real world strategic interaction that happened in a way that was puzzling and different than we would expect. So I think that is absolutely critical. I think it's fine if the opening hook is different than the case. You know, I also think I think you also could go the route of like kind of just bringing in the necessary parts of the Namibia case as the hook. Like that's okay too. And footnoting or somehow alluding that like all of the details will come later in the paper. So I think either way is fine, but one path, like you have to do one of those two to get like, because that also goes further in selling the importance of the paper, like the importance and the relevance, and like all of a sudden my mind is like, oh, okay, I'm picturing like this real world actor as the first player and this one as another player, and so like I'm like keeping that with me for the whole paper, and it walks me through some of the more complicated parts with actual images in my brain.
Yeah. Yeah, I could not agree more. I think that'll make the paper significantly stronger, and it'll make the contribution clearer because you have one. It's like, you know, just to sort of like make sure that that's clear. It's like the issue is not that there isn't a contribution. The issue is that you like make sure that the reader knows that, you know. So I think another on this framing, I mean, another sort of a general principle that I try to use that I feel like has been helpful for me when I am framing a paper where the main contribution is a model is to think about how to communicate to the reader that what I'm doing in the paper is I'm going to offer them a lens through which to view some kind of strategic interaction, and that lens is going to be helpful for them to understand, you know. And so like when I think about like what I consider like the best papers that use formal theory, they're things like, you know, the Spence signaling paper, right? Or like the market for lemons, or in our corner of the world, I mean, the Fearon 95 paper is an exemplar of this, where all of these papers have the same property, which is the following. Once you have read their explanation of whatever they're trying to explain, it is really hard to think about that phenomena without viewing it through the lens of the model. Right? Because the model offers such a compelling explanation. And I think that's what you should sort of like, you know, when you're thinking about how to frame, you should try to frame it around that, making it clear to the reader that that's the contribution, right? It's a lens through which to view all this stuff. And then you get back to what Lindsay was suggesting, then that lens provides empirical implications, right? It's kind of a general, you know, suggestion about how to think about writing that front end of the paper.
Yeah. And like, would it be fair to say it could be helpful to circle back to empirical implications at some point later in the paper, so that, you know, you're kind of, whether it's work that you do later on or that, you know, like contemporaries who are working on this topic would do. Like, kind of, here are some of the testable implications and the ways that, like, I hope future work can build upon this logic, and bring it into the empirical realm.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to do it, because like you said, I mean, it's, you know, sort of doing a quantitative test in this paper is just going to be difficult for space considerations, if nothing else. Another way you can think about it is, so the idea of sort of talking about future work is a good way to go. Another idea that I like this when I see it in papers is, if, and you have to think about whether this is something you can do given the results, but if there's sort of conflicting empirical findings in the literature, if it's possible to use your model to sort of sort through why you get one result in some situations and a different result in another situation, that can be another compelling way to engage with the empirical literature and demonstrate what we get out of the model there. Okay, so we're almost at time. So Lindsay, were there any other comments that you wanted to make sure we got to?
I think that was pretty much everything for me. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any last thoughts?
To your minor points.
Yeah. Yes.
So
my minor points on the model.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll email them to you if that's okay. It's nothing. None of them are worth talking about. They're very simple. They're mostly. So I have some ideas about, like, the way you describe it as an agency problem, and some other papers that are relevant that you could engage with and further, like, communicate the contribution.
Actually, am I using the term agency slack correctly?
That was a question I had. I'll send it to you later. I think more or less yes.
Okay.
But yeah, we can. We're getting close to time. I don't want to. I know people have
Okay.
have it's busy. It's end of semester time. So okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for the paper. Lindsay, thank you a ton for the careful read and really, really great feedback. Thanks everybody in the audience. And so our next presentation will be it will be on December 1st at 10 a.m. My co-coordinator, Chelsea Estancona, will be leading the discussion. And we'll have a presentation December 1st at 10 a.m. Central Time from Valerie Lee and Cyan Loyal, of a paper called Northern Ireland and the Framing of Post-Conflict Justice. So tune in. We hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.